We want to now take a deep dive into what the president was holding up in the Rose Garden. It's a list of countries and the tariffs he is imposing on those countries. There are questions about how the Trump administration arrived at those tariffs on said countries in the first place. So let's try to explain. Phil Mattingly is here. Walk us through. I have to say, just looking at that, I get a little bit of a stomachache because this whole situation, as somebody who hates math, scares me.
Just the visual itself is not helping us out in the whole try and explain thing.
This is the formula that they use to get to the list that they have and the tariffs that are happening now.
And by the way, if you're watching and looking, you're not supposed to understand what this means. In fact, that's kind of part of the play here. But let me explain what it actually means, because I think, as Dana was pointing out, the critical question yesterday when we were looking at the chart and when we were actually looking at the numbers, like the 34% number is the actual tariff that the U.S. is putting on China, adding others on top of it, stacking them together. And how they got there, given the fact it didn't correlate with the actual tariffs we know China has on the U.S. or any other country has on the U.S., was a real question that everybody's trying to figure out, particularly because they are so high and they are so dramatic. So let's take Vietnam. You mentioned Vietnam earlier in the show, which is obviously a huge exporter to the United States because U.S. people buy Vietnamese goods. What does it actually mean? Trading between the U.S. and Vietnam is based on 2024 census data, which is the data that was utilized to come up with the calculation. Vietnam exports $136.6 billion in goods to the U.S. The U.S. exports $13.1 billion in goods to Vietnam. Now, how did they get to the 90%, which they cut in half to 46%? What they did is they subtracted the Vietnamese goods bought by the U.S., $136.6 billion, total U.S. goods bought by Vietnam, and ended up with $123.5 billion. Now, the way they actually got to the 90% number is they did 123.5 divided by 136.6, which equals 0.90, or 90%.
And then half of that.
And then, because of the benevolence of President Trump, as he kind of laid it out, then they cut that in half. Now, the big question, of course, is that's not necessarily a number or a methodology that economists could identify with. In fact, the most interesting moment of the night, throughout the course of the night last night, was economists of all sides, all ideologies, Republican and Democrat, staring at the methodology and saying, that's not how this is supposed